Okay, so this is lecture two on the base superstructure relation. I wanted to call your attention to this particular website that I found rather helpful and illuminating. And it's called inequality.org. And this particular part of the website called Income Inequality in the United States, Gaps in Earnings Between America's Most Affluent and the Rest of the Country Continue to Grow Year After Year. And I put this on our Blackboard site under Readings and Miscellany. If you would like to read this particular article or just peruse the graphs here, like for instance, this one, richest 0.1% take in 196 times as much as the bottom 90%. And this is as of 2018. U.S. inequality has returned to Gilded Age levels, the Gilded Age right before the Great Depression, whereby corporations had basically taken over all of the major social and political institutions in the United States, including the state. So, corporate influence within the sphere of the state, this particularly powerful aspect of the superstructure, this is really dangerous stuff, and it's happening right now. More and more corporate influence on the state, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and even the judicial branch. Top 1% income share has doubled while poverty is held steady, right? Since 1968. And there are various other, illustrative and quite stunning graphs, like for instance, this one. Even the gap between the top 1% and the top 20% is huge. This is US before tax income by income group 2016. And things have arguably become even worse since 2016, and they're not getting any better. The richest Americans have had the fastest income growth. So you kind of get the point. We live in a so-called democracy whereby uh, corporate influence uh, in most of our social and political institutions has become, so colossal and so normalized that it's hard for people to see the the monopoly on power the corporations have, and the top 1%, the ruling class, has in our society. How it affects things like access to social resources like education, like healthcare, even higher ed for that matter. Many of you are probably struggling with loans, and you're saddled with debt, and you're probably worried about how you're going to pay off that debt after you leave and graduate from the university. So Marxist theory is very, very helpful for you to be able to understand uh, how and why it is that the ruling class, once it gets a solid purchase on power, is able to stack the deck in political and economic terms in their favor at the expense of most everybody else in society, especially the working class, uh, the working poor, the unemployed. And so, with COVID-19 happening right now, all of these trends are just being, radically exacerbated at the moment. Okay, which is why Marx and understanding Marx probably matters now more than ever, because I think that one can make the case, and it's not even an argument. I think it is indeed the case that capitalism in the United States and across the globe is in crisis right now. So there are tremendous opportunities that may emerge from this crisis. People might be able to attain to a certain type of class consciousness that enables them to see through the lies and the distortions of ideology that are pumped out into the cultural atmosphere by the superstructure. So I want to read this section from Marxism 2 on the base superstructure relation for y'all. And then I'll embroider on a couple of things as I read through. Grab my trusty pen to hold my place here when I need to stop, okay? So remember that the base refers to the sphere of production, the place where commodities are produced, which implies a social relation, the relation between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. In other words, the social relations of production. Marx maintains that the base gives rise to a superstructure, which refers to a range of social and political institutions that are basically created, owned, in a manner of speaking, maintained, and developed by the bourgeoisie. Also, keep in mind that the superstructure takes years, generations, even centuries to develop. Right, so it's fully developed right now. But when Marx looks at the long history of capitalist societies and the circumstances in which capitalism emerged from European feudalism, he notices that it takes a certain degree of time for the superstructure, what he refers to as the superstructure, to develop from the base, which is, say, the economic structure of society. So the bourgeoisie has to amass and save a certain amount of surplus value, which is to say profit, before it starts building and investing in a superstructure to secure, to maintain, and also to legitimate uh, what is referred to as a superstructure, which, as you'll know from the previous lecture, is a kind of massive insurance policy that works to maintain the asymmetrical power relationship between the bourgeoisie and the working class, or the proletariat, right? Which is to say, the social relations of production, right? So here are the big aspects of the superstructure that I invoked in the previous lecture: the state or the government, the military, the police, legal institutions or the law, media and the press, sometimes referred to as the means of communication, the means of representation, education, schools, colleges, universities. What gets taught in schools is, depending upon the situation that we are considering, can be thought of as an example of ideological indoctrination, right? Especially with respect to the way that history is taught. So, though the superstructure can refer generally to the sciences and the arts, even the church, I'm going to simply discuss how the capitalist investment in the institutions I listed above work to structure, maintain, and reproduce the social relations of production. Remember, if the social relations of production become unstable and the proletariat of the working class starts acting up, getting fed up with their working conditions, the measly wage that they are being paid, which is oftentimes barely enough just to make ends meet, as many of us may actually know from experience. Then production declines along with the production of the surplus value. The capitalist needs to remain in power. Hence, the superstructure plays an important role in structuring and determining the subjectivities or the minds of the proletariat. That is, it is an insurance policy against revolution and anything that threatens the economic and political interests of the dominant class. So the capitalist creates, maintains, and reproduces his power over the proletariat through hard power and soft power. Okay, this is an important distinction from Marx. Distinction between hard power and soft power. So hard power refers to brute physical force and the force of the authority of the law. As I suggested in previous lectures, the capitalist ensures his power over the proletariat by investing in the state, the military, and the police. However, this power is largely a function of the law, which legitimates the bourgeoisie's use of hard power in definite circumstances. For example, riots, the destruction or theft of private property, protest, and anything that's deemed to be revolutionary activity. You'll hear our current president referring to dissidents, people who are protesting at Black Lives Matter protests, for instance, as terrorists, right? So he's using the power of the state to stigmatize people who have, from my point of view, very, very legitimate complaints about the circumstances in which society is operating right now. He's labeling them as terrorist threats. Okay. So notice, for instance, by the way, how Rochester threatens to call the police when Christophane in Wide Sargasso Sea starts challenging his authority. At this point, it may be helpful to quote Marx on the state. So in the Communist Manifesto, which was one of Marx's more accessible and shorter works, he states the following about the state, which again is an important aspect of the superstructure. Quote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, end quote. So this may seem like an outlandish claim to make, that the state is nothing but an instrument for the maintenance and control of the economic and political interests of the bourgeoisie. But if we look into history, we can see that Marx has virtually hit the bullseye here. For instance, in early 19th century England, only men who legally owned large estates were granted the right to vote. So the franchise, in other words, the right to vote for working class men and women, would have to wait, and the right to vote was won eventually through what Marx would ultimately refer to as class conflict. So to vote for someone to represent your rights and interests during this time, you basically had to be a member of the dominant class. If you weren't a member of the dominant class, and if you weren't a male, and if you weren't white, then you really didn't have rights per se, as we understand them now, right? Those would have to be fought for, right? Since elected officials depend upon the votes of people of their own class, they better damn well be sure they're representing the interests of the bourgeoisie in the situation I'm talking about in the early 19th century. So since elected officials are already bourgeois in their instincts, it makes sense that it would have a vested interest in institutionalizing laws that reflect the economic and political interests of their class. That said, generally speaking, the state, for Marx, and for Marxist theory, both legislates and enforces the interests of a very narrow sector of human society. Generally, that tends to be the case, right? I think one can make a solid and strong and cogent argument. That's the case right now, if you look at American society. Just think on, for instance, whether Antoinette's interests as a woman are represented by the state in Wide Sargasso Sea. It refers to Jamaica and the larger world, also Europe, the United Kingdom, or Britain in the early to mid 19th century. So when Rochester marries her, he is legally entitled to her inheritance from Mr. Mason. The English law, again, an aspect of the superstructure, and custom, which is part of culture, is just only for the privileged few, we might state. So we can see how the superstructure is, twisted irony, bought or purchased by the surplus value produced by the proletariat, without which the bourgeoisie would not be able to erect a superstructure to begin with. Okay? Again, the bourgeoisie because it has access to capital and power, and because it basically owns the superstructure, has the power to depress wages so they're more or less equal to the cost of subsistence, so that the working class of the proletariat are able to produce the vast majority of value in the Marxist sense that ultimately ends up in the hands of the bourgeoisie in surplus value that they then reinvest in an oppressive state in various state apparatuses and laws, what have you, that make it easier for them to keep wages suppressed at that level, which is more or less, equal to the cost of subsistence, so that the working class is working hard just to make ends meet and don't have the time or the energy to effectively organize until things get so bad that they really have no other option than to join together in solidarity and risk life and limb in order to protest an oppressive state that operates basically on behalf of the interests of capital or the bourgeoisie. Well, what happens if the proletariat starts to become attuned to this sort of irony? Or what happens if they start to organize and wish to challenge a political, economic, legal, and social system that unfairly extracts surplus value from their labor power to create institutions that do not reflect their interests? The short answer is that the capitalist uses hard power, the police, backed by the law, to protect what they're legally entitled to, private property, for instance. Uh, but if that doesn't work, the capitalist can use soft power or ideology to persuade the proletariat that their rebelliousness is vain and misguided. So I described ideology as the sentiments, ideas, values, beliefs, and ideals of the dominant class. Ideology also invariably reflects or represents the economic and political interests of the bourgeoisie in capitalist societies. For instance, the society that we live in right now. In other words, ideology works to rationalize, justify, and legitimate the power of the ruling class. Now, one final way to think of ideology. Ideology structures, conditions, and maintains subjectivity or consciousness, what we think, feel, or believe about any number of subjects, right? For instance, what is a fair wage? What is a living wage? Um, uh, Actually, here's another one for you. Ideology is the air we breathe. It is everywhere. And the reason it's everywhere is because it is delivered to us by the superstructure. So the law is a reflection of ideology. Indeed, one might say that law is ideology. Think, for example, of how black men and women were viewed by European society for hundreds of years. Implicit in the law that permitted black men, women, and children to be viewed as property are a whole host of assumptions about the superiority of European men and the slaves, again, a legal category, supposed inferiority. In this case, the law is shot through with a whole host of ideological assumptions or ideas about people with white skin and people with black skin. That said, the law not only reflects ideology for Marx, it also reflects how whites and blacks are conditioned to think and feel about themselves. That is, ideology structures subjectivity. Furthermore, the law or ideology reflects the bourgeoisie's economic and political interests. Think about it. It's essential for the bourgeoisie to believe that blacks are inferior in the case that I'm referring to, namely, the world is represented by wide Sargasso Sea, which we are all familiar with. It supports their belief, like, for instance, Rochester's belief, Mr. Mason's belief in their superiority and their right to exploit slaves to make money from their labor power. Uh, And where does racial ideology come from, you might ask? It is created by the bourgeoisie and it is disseminated or propagated by the means of communication: the press, newspapers, education, legal documents, philosophy, and yes, even literature. Where, after all, do you surmise characters like Rochester and Mr. Mason get their ideas on race, or even gender, or women for that matter? It's part of the atmosphere they breathe. Newspapers, books, the intellectual culture of the time and place in which their subjectivities are immersed. Now, if the bourgeoisie owns the sphere of production, the base, and the superstructure, the medium through which ideology is communicated, then they have the means to not only control the production of commodities and wealth, they also have the means to control what ideas, thoughts, and feelings on any number of subjects or topics are legitimate or alternatively illegitimate. Since the bourgeoisie basically owns the means of intellectual production, and by that I mean, for example, the production of ideas and the means of communication, their ideas tend to predominate in capitalist societies. They saturate the cultural atmosphere that we breathe and that we're immersed in. If you read Orwell's 1984, you might be familiar with the term newspeak, which is basically synonymous with ideology, or what we might call propaganda. So, to end this section, I want you to remember the following: the base produces the superstructure, which in turn produces and disseminates ideas, which is to say ideology, which in their turn produce subjectivity, both for the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and I would include the middle classes. Hard power, or brute force, maintains the social relations of production, which is to say the dominance of the bourgeoisie over the working class. So they can dictate to them a wage that is basically depressed to the point where it is more or less equal to the cost of reproducing their labor power, the cost of subsistence, by making fearful that they may be harmed, killed, or imprisoned if they act up and threaten the economic and political interests of the capitalist class, right? uh, Protest, revolt, what have you. Soft power or ideology works in a more subtle or insidious way. It works to convince people that the status quo is just rational or natural, just the way things are or are supposed to be. Okay, so I'm going to end this lecture, and the next lecture is going to be on Marx's concept of history as a product of class struggle. I'm also going to recommend that you not read through, but watch these screencast video lectures in small doses. I would say 1 or 2 max per day. Okay. Okay. We'll see you in a little bit.